Guys, so now we are moving on to the urinary system, which is also known as the renal system. So I kind of go back and forth between those, but they mean the same thing. You should be familiar with the term renal. Anytime you see renal, that means it's related to the kidneys, and you should have seen it already with the renal artery and the renal vein. That just means they're going to feed and drain the kidneys. Okay, so renal, kidneys. So the first thing I want to do is go through the gross anatomy of the renal system. We're going to talk about the organs involved in the renal system, and then we're going to spend more time talking about the structure of a kidney. So if you section the kidney, what it'll look like. And then I'll do a second lecture on the microscopic structure of the nephron, which is the functional unit of the kidney. Okay, so speaking of function, let's talk about what the kidneys do. So here we have the kidneys, and you notice that they have a pretty significant blood supply going in, and then they have a whole branch of blood vessels branching through, which we will learn the names of, and then it'll be drained away. So the function of the kidney is to filter blood, and as it's filtering that blood, it's going to create a different fluid, which is called urine. So your kidneys create and make urine, and as they're making urine, the reason they're making urine is for several reasons. The first is to remove something called urea, and urea is where the name urine comes from. And urea is a nitrogenous waste, which just means that it has nitrogen in it, and it's produced when you metabolize or break down proteins to make energy from them. So we need to remove that urea because it is toxic. And the other thing that it does is as the blood is being filtered through the nephron and through the kidney, we also get the opportunity to regulate the levels of what's in the blood so that we can help regulate the levels in the body. Okay, so the first one is the water balance. We get to choose how much water remains in the body, and if you think about it, right, if you really drink tons of water, you have more urine, so that you just get rid of your extra water. Or if you're really dehydrated, you'll have less urine. Okay, so that helps make sure that the water levels, which are really just plasma levels in your blood, remain constant, and that's very important for maintaining blood pressure. And then the other thing it gets to choose is electrolytes. And electrolytes are just a fancy way of saying salt ions. So keep that in mind when you drink your Gatorade. So things like sodium and potassium ions, those are used in muscle function, neuron function, so several places throughout the body. And so they need to make sure they have very consistent, normal level supplies. And then the last one is things like hydrogen ions, which is just your pH, whether or not it's acidic or basic, and that helps maintain your blood pH at a very specific level because it gets to choose what goes into the blood and what comes out. So acids in or bases in or whatever it needs to make sure it maintains a specific level. Okay, so we're going to filter the blood and we're going to make urine out of it. Okay, so let's look at the organs in the urinary system. So here we have the kidneys, and if you're looking at this picture right here, what we're looking at is a dissected cat where we take the intestines and we kind of moved them off to the side. So the kidneys are going to be located in the very back along the back of your body, your abdominal wall. So if you look at this picture right here, here's the bottom of the rib cage. So if you get they ever talk about a kidney punch, it really is on the very back here. So it'll be right behind your muscles here. And the kidneys are even what we call retroperitoneal. Retro means behind, and peritoneal is referring to peritoneum. And so really what it is it's not actually in the cavity. It is in the cavity, but it's behind the parietal peritoneum. Okay, so it's not where all of the rest of this stuff is because it's going to be behind the parietal peritoneum. So to get at the kidney in the cat, you have to peel off the parietal peritoneum that covers that back wall, and then you have to peel away a bunch of adipose tissue. So there's, in real life, there would be a big deposit of loose adipose connective tissue surrounding that kidney. And the function of that is to protect the kidney, but also to make sure that the kidney stays in place. Okay, so it keeps it nice and snug in place. Okay, so in this picture here, this would be the kidneys, but that up there would be the liver. Okay, so the liver would sit right about here. So this right here would be the right kidney. And then coming down here, this tube, this soft flexible tube, that would be the ureter. So the function of the ureter is to take that urine that was created by the kidney, and then it's going to be taken to the urinary bladder to be stored there. Now, please note that I said urinary bladder. I often say the word bladder, but really you should use the words urinary bladder, and especially in the lab practical, make sure you use the word urinary bladder, not just bladder. And then there's another tube, which is called the urethra, that helps get the urine out. Okay, so be careful. Two words, both sound very similar. You have the ureter between the kidney and the urinary bladder, and then you have the urethra with a TH, urethra, that helps where you pee out of. That's your pee tube right there. Okay. Okay, now let's spend a little bit more time talking about the structure of the kidney. So keeping in mind the orientation of the kidneys in the body, what plane was this kidney sectioned along? Ooh. Okay, it gets a front and a back. So this would be a frontal section. Okay, so basically what you do is you take the kidney and you cut it right along the frontal plane, and it kind of opens up like a book, as you can see right here. Okay, so just sort of flap it open. And the first thing I want to point out is that there's two general regions within the kidney. And I say region because that means that it includes more than one specific structure. So make sure on the practical and the lab quizzes you look for the word region. If it's a region, I'm talking about one of two things. If it's on the outside, that's going to be called the renal cortex. And you've seen this word cortex before when we talked about the brain. Remember the cerebral cortex. So a cortex is just a broad term that means on the outside of a solid organ. Okay, so it'll be the renal cortex, which would be this outer region right here along the outside there. And then you have the renal medulla, remember medulla like a middle, okay, and that is this region right here. Now the renal medulla includes two specific structures. You have the renal pyramids, and they're called that because they make a pyramid shape. Nothing fancy about that. And then between the renal pyramids, you're going to have the renal columns, which are the long columns of lighter colored material between them. So if you're looking at this picture here, these dark structures here, those would be the renal pyramids. So 1, 2, 3, and so forth. Those are the renal pyramids. And then the lighter structures between the renal pyramids, those would be the renal columns. Okay? Okay, so all of that makes up the renal medulla, the middle region. And then even kind of more in the inside here, sort of near where the hilum would be. Hilum is just, again, where the indent is, where things enter and exit. Okay, so here's the hilum right here. So near the hilum, we have what's called the renal pelvis. And the renal pelvis makes a basin-like collecting bin where all the urine that will be created from the cortex and run down the medulla will be collected in here before it exits through the ureter. So right before you enter the ureter, that will be the renal pelvis. Okay, so the renal pelvis is the big empty like basin, like a sink bowl. And then running into them, you have the major and minor calyxes. So calyxes is the plural version. The singular version is going to be calyx. Calyx with an X. Let's see, do I have that? No, we don't have that. Calyx with an X. Okay, so YX, calyx. And then, so let's talk about the difference between major and minor, because that always gets students confused. So minor would mean that it is smaller, so it's only going to be connecting to the tips. Okay, and so you have just one little kind of connected way. If you have more than one minor calyces feeding into it, it's going to be the major calyx. Okay, so for example, on this picture here, this would be a minor calyx, smaller, nothing feeding into it except for the pyramid here. And then down here, this would be the major calyx because you have more than one minor calyx feeding into it, and then it'll empty into the renal pelvis, and then that'll go into the ureter, and the ureter will take it to the bladder, to the urinary bladder. Okay. So what I would like you to do is go ahead and try to draw it. Okay, so I really think that drawing is a good way to sort of connect the two cerebral hemispheres and help you remember everything. So do a nice quick drawing of the renal kidney and then try to label all of these places. Okay, but I am going to move on. So remind you of the renal arteries and the veins. Okay, so here is the aorta. I know it's the aorta because it has a thicker tunica media. Those thick walls give it a nice, more round structure. Remember, I say round like a rope. And then this would be the inferior vena cava. And the inferior vena cava has a thin wall because it's a vein. It's a thin wall, but a big lumen. And so the renal vein, it is going to be also have that thin wall. So remember, it's going to be flat like a ribbon, because it doesn't have the structure to keep it open. So here is the renal vein, and here is the renal artery. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the path of the blood flow through the kidney, and that's going to lead us into a discussion of the nephron in the next segment. Okay, so from the aorta, okay, so here's the abdominal aorta for being more specific, abdominal aorta. Here is the renal artery, and the renal artery will enter into the kidney at the hilum. From there, it's going to branch off into what are called the segmental arteries. Okay, so they segment the renal arteries. They break it up into pieces. Okay, and then from there, those segmental arteries are going to run through the columns. Note that they're not running through the pyramids. The pyramids have different structures in them. They're going to run through the columns. And when they're running through the columns, those are called the interlobar. So remember that inter means between. So that helps me remember that they're between the pyramids. So the red vessels, again, they'll be red, the red arteries, the red vessels running between the pyramids, that is going to be the interlobar arteries. And then you'll notice that the interlobar arteries go arc, that's how I say that, they arc around the top of the renal pyramids. When they arc, make a little, like a rainbow arc, those are called the arcuate arteries. Arcuate, arc around the top of it. And then coming off radiating off of them are going to be the cortical radiate arteries. Okay, so they're in the cortex and they radiate. So think of like radiate, like sun rays radiating off of them. Okay, so when they have a bunch of little radiating vessels coming off of the arcuate artery, that is now going to be called the cortical radiate artery. Okay, so notice that all of these names have some sort of descriptive meaning to them. So renal artery segments or breaks up into the segmental arteries, and then they run between the column, in between the pyramids, so they're interlobar arteries, and then they arc across the top, so those are the arcuate arteries, and then they radiate out into the cortex, and so that is the cortical radiate arteries. From there, they're going to enter into the nephron, and I haven't talked about the nephron yet, but I will in the next section. So they'll go through the nephron. While they're in the nephron, they'll get filtered, and now we have to come back in the veins. Okay, so from the nephron, they'll be drained into the cortical radiate veins. So please notice that it's pretty much just the backwards pathway that we just went. There is one major exception that I'm hoping that you will guess or find as we go through. Okay, so here we are in the cortical radiate veins. Again, they're in the cortex and they radiate out to the starbursts on the outside there. And then from there, they're going to empty into the interlobar, sorry, I said that wrong. They're going to empty into the arcuate veins, which arc along the top. Okay, remember, arc like rainbows along the top of the pyramid. So here would be arcuate. There's the arcuate vein. From the arcuate veins, they'll travel into the interlobar veins. Remember, inter means between, so we'll help you remind that between the pyramids. Those are the interlobar veins. Then from there, they're going to empty into the renal veins. And the renal vein will then dump into the inferior vena cava. So what was missing? Okay, what did I not say? That is the segmental veins. There are no segmental veins. Okay, so anything between here and all the way here, all of this is considered the interlobar vein. No segmental veins, just segmental arteries. Okay, so other than that though, they're just the same order, but in reverse, and just call them a vein. So just remember, arteries are red, veins are blue. The only exception to that is the pulmonary arteries and veins. All the other ones, red artery, blue vein. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop, and then I'll do another one for the nephron.